Introduction to JSP Development. We're going to continue along our discussion about web application programming and development using Java technologies, focusing in on now on Java Server Pages or JSPs. So the first thing I want to kind of go over is what is exactly a JSP page, what is that all about, and why do I want to do it? Okay, I think there are some really good important reasons then you'll like, and we'll kind of compare and contrast a little bit to servlets, which we talked about in an earlier couple of videos, and we'll talk about now JSP pages, because they both kind of do the same thing, but yet one has an advantage over the next, depending on a situation, okay? Then, of course, we'll go into some fundamental JSP syntax, like utilizing variables and expressions, the implicit objects that are available, using directives, those are very important, and how to handle errors in your JSP applications. Let's go ahead and start by starting up Tomcat. So again, this window comes up with Windows XP Service Pack 2, and I placed these two shortcuts on my desktop. I took them right out of the Tomcat directory. And this DOS prompt will go ahead and start up Tomcat for us. And while we're waiting, I'm going to kind of go ahead and minimize this, and I'm going to bring up the directory where I've got a couple of JSP pages kind of hiding. So C Jakarta Web Apps RB Test 1, and let's go ahead and see in there. And you'll notice in there I've got a couple of files. Both, let me sort by type here, got a couple files here, actually three, ending in a .jsp page, ending in a .jsp, or file extension rather, okay? So let's go ahead and minimize that and verify that Tomcat's up and running. Yep, server started in 7,841 milliseconds. Perfect. So we'll go ahead and kind of minimize you. And then I'm going to make a request. Now, here's what's important. Watch this. I'm going to go to HTTP and go to the path of that JSP page. Now, the reason why it's important to see this is because notice how I'm accessing the page via HTTP, which means it has to be served back to me from an HTTP service. In other words, a web server, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I go ahead and click OK, and it's going to send the request to the web server. And we'll go ahead and let IE do its thing. You can see it's finding a site, and it's fairly quick. Notice it's a .jsp, not a .html, not a .cfm or .asp for active server page X, ASPX, whatever. No, it's a .jsp, Java server page. And this means that this page was rendered to me. And if you'll see in there, I've got the current date and time in there. And the only way to get the current date and time to come from the server, essentially, is by using some form of server-side technology. I could have used local client JavaScript in there as well, but I didn't. I'll go ahead and schedule my corporate meeting scheduler. So we'll go ahead and put a time. Let's say we're going to meet today at 2:30 p.m. And we'll meet in the Sedona room. And we'll talk about 2005 initiatives. Go ahead and submit it. Something magical will kind of happen. I submit the page. Now, notice up here what happens. Notice how I have the scheduler.jsp page was called, and I'm passing to it a couple of variables through the URL or the address string, okay? And here's my meeting confirmation. We're going to meet at 2:30 on this date and time, or rather on this time, on this date, in this room, talking about 2005 initiatives. So a JSP page really looks like, it's a web page, okay? The first thing I want to reiterate, as I said earlier, is the page has to be served to you by HTTP server, okay, a web server. For example, here are HTML pages, okay? I could, notice I'm at C colon here. I'm in my Windows Explorer. I can go ahead and not create a shortcut there. I can go ahead and double click on like test.html. So let me go ahead and double click on it. And you'll notice that because it's an HTML page and it's not doing any kind of tricky server-side stuff, the page loads up fine. Microsoft IE will load and render that page. But watch what happens when I double-click on test.jsp. I'll go ahead and double-click on it, and it will open up for editing in Notepad. Okay? In other words, it didn't get served to me by the server. You can double-click on any of these pages, and it will get opened up by whatever page or whatever program is deemed to open up the .jsp file for editing. The only way to see the results of a JSP is to have it sent back to you via HTTP, just like what I was doing here. Okay, so HTTP. So what exactly is going on? Let's kind of take a look and see what's happening here. The first thing that's going to happen is a request is made by a client to the web server for a .jsp page. Now the client, because all of this stuff is happening on the server, it could really be anything. You're not have to worry about, oh, does Netscape support JSP or does Internet Explorer support JSP? Nope, you don't have to worry about that because it's all happening on the server. So you make a request for a .jsp page. Now what's interesting is the service and the server will receive that. Now let's talk about the server here for a second. We've talked a little bit about that before. This web server has to support what's called a JSP container. The web server has to support what's called a JSP container. Now, there are various containers, some that are free, some that you can get. Tomcat, well, Apache web server with Tomcat installed provides for you a JSP container. It also provides a servlet container as well. But you have to use Apache Tomcat for that. Otherwise, there are third-party Java containers, JSP servlet containers, that you can put onto something like Microsoft Internet Information Server. So what happens is when a JSP page is called, that is then called by the container. And now we're going to go to step 3. And what step 3 is going to do is it's going to load that page. And this arrow here is showing you what's going to happen inside of the container, the JSP container running inside of this web server, Tomcat. The page loads, and then it gets compiled. And then a service method is called. Now, what's interesting about what's happening here is that a JSP container essentially loads your JSP pages and on the fly converts your JSP pages into servlets. And the very first time that that happens on your server, essentially the first time your JSP container receives that request for a JSP document, that is called translation time. Then what happens is that web server executes that servlets service method, produces HTML in a response format, and that response is called request time. So we have translation time and request time. Now, the biggest thing I want you to take away from this is that JSP pages really are another way of writing servlets, but you have some advantages to doing so. So a JSP page, when it comes through your container on your application/web server, it gets converted into a servlet on the fly. Now, we, in our 2 series, we talked about the init method, or do get or do post. The service method is a function of the javax.servlet generic servlet class, which HTTP servlets extend from. So this is where the service method comes from. So let's take a look at the anatomy of a JSP page really quick. All right, let's go into my directory here, and I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to open it up with our good old buddy TextPad. So right click on that, send it into there, and here we have TextPad. Now One of the things that you're going to notice about a JSP page is it essentially combines static HTML with some weird looking Java-like syntax, like there. Notice how I've got HTML combined with the Java syntax there. I've got some things that are not very HTML-like, but they're at the top of the page. If I scroll down, we can see some more kind of things in here. So you can see it's just a lot of HTML with a little bit of Java-like code in there. That's one page. Let's go ahead and throw this scheduler JSP page into TextPad as well. Bring that up. And here's the scheduler. And you can see more Java-like syntax right in here. So one of the first things that you notice right off the bat is that JSP allows a programmer to create a template. Let's take a look at, let me throw the scheduler in here. And then what I want to do is let's go into a servlet. Let's go into the, let's see, C Java / servlets. Let's take a look at a more advanced servlet that we kind of built a little earlier. nwinsearch.java. Okay, so let's bring that up. And now what I want to do is I want to tile this for, let's do it horizontally. And we'll take one JSP page. So this will be pretty cool. And we'll do a servlet. So let's stretch you out a little bit. And let's move you down. Move you up. Okay, so what do we see as differences right off the bat? Well, for one thing, that's obviously, this is a .java file, and this is a .jsp file. This .java file gets compiled. It becomes a class file, okay, nwinsearch.class, and then it has to go into the C, or wherever I install my Jakarta, it has to go into my web-inf. So let's go into C Jakarta. Okay, that class file to deploy a servlet. Remember, this is hopefully kind of a review. We go into web apps. We go into my directory, web-inf, put it into the classes directory. Then what I have to do is I have to modify my web.xml. Okay. Whereas this JSP page doesn't have to go through all that stuff. I create a .jsp file, and I don't even have to put it in the web-inf directory. I just put it at the root of my website virtual directory. See, there are the JSP pages. So the first thing is it's a little easier than servlets in that it doesn't require so much deploying and configuring of Tomcat for that. Okay, now let's take a look at the second big difference. The second really big difference to me is that this is just a JSP is really developing a full-blown class. Okay, there's no HTML in there whatsoever. Don't be confused. String data, okay, is not HTML. Like this string data here, it is going to be rendered as HTML, but it's just string data. So, you know, it's a regular Java program, a servlet, right? I have all my import statements. I create a public class. I go ahead and put in my method, in this example, do post. I implement my method, compile it, and deploy it. Okay, whereas a JSP page rather is almost like a template of HTML with little sparses of special JSP goop that we'll talk a little bit more about in the beginning. So here's the big difference to me of JSPs versus servlets. I would use servlets when I really need a full-blown application in the background, okay? Servlets have a very important place. They're extremely, extremely powerful. I mean, they're classes for Pete's sakes. Whereas JSPs are good when I want to really focus in on producing dynamic HTML from a template like what I have here. All right, so now that we kind of took a look at the differences between servlets and JSP pages, and we kind of saw why I might want to focus on servlets over, or rather, why I might want to focus on JSPs over servlets and how the whole thing works, let's start talking about some of the fundamental basics of JSP syntax. Now, it's really important that you understand that JSP pages are first processed in the servlet, the JSP container, either at request time or translation time. Then what happens is the rest of it, like this HTML, is streamed down to the client and it's rendered as HTML and then interpreted. So how do we know what gets processed on the server first and then gets processed on the client as HTML? We use special tags, and those special tags will will start with a open angle bracket and then a percent sign and then a percent sign and then a close angle bracket. So anything inside of here, anything that starts in that is inside of this section here is going to be processed on the server, either at request time or translation time. Anything that looks like just traditional HTML, like, something like, oh, a table tag with, a table row and a table data and all this kind of stuff, well, this is going to be processed on the client. So let's go ahead and write the most basic possible JSP page that you can write. And let's start with this. So I'm going to do an open angle bracket and then a percent and two dashes. And I'll call this simple JSP.jsp. Now, anything inside of this construct where I start with an angle bracket, an open paren, two dashes, and then close it as such, that is essentially a JSP comment. And this, I'm doing this on purpose because this is just really traditionally, or not traditionally, it is HTML. So HTML, we'll put in a head, we'll put in a title, simple JSP page, title, close the head, open a body, and we'll just do an H1, align equals center, simple JSP page. I think you're getting the point that this is a really basic JSP page. Close the body, close the HTML. Now, the key part of it is that I have to save it with a .jsp file extension. All right, so I will call this simple JSP.jsp. There's my .jsp file extension. By the way, TextPad isn't smart enough to know about JSP, so it will just stay all one solid color. Now, this stuff will get processed on the server first. Now, it happens to be a comment, so it's ignored, but the server goes, oh, I'll go ahead and ignore that. But just to go ahead and see what happens here, simple JSP.jsp. And if I didn't make a typo, we should go ahead and get something. Now, this is translation and request time here. As you can see what's happening, the first time a JSP page gets called, it gets compiled and that service method gets called and it's converting into a servlet. And it takes a while, but any subsequent time, like if I do a control F5 here, you'll see that that page loads really quick because that servlet is kind of cached there. And that's essentially the most fundamental thing you can do. Now, let's kind of build a little bit along with it, and we'll start talking about directives and other various syntaxes. What if you wanted to do something like, well, you know how in every other Java application you write, you use the import statement? Well, we can do that the same thing in a JSP page using a page directive. And the page directive starts like this. Let me back up a little bit. You use your open angle bracket percent, and then you use the @ sign, and then you say page. And the page directive is used to do things like specify importing of, it's like packages, how to set the content type, session information, whether or not you're extending another package or class, whether or not you want to send the specify an error page, the language. Basically, a JSP directive, a JSP page directive, is essential further information to the servlet processing engine about general setup of the servlet. So here we'll do a page, and I'll go ahead and specify the directive, and we'll do something like import equals, and then the value of java.util.date. And then I end it with a %sign angle bracket. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and declare a variable. And when I declare a variable, I use another symbol. So here, I use a symbol of an @ sign. Here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the %. But now look at this, exclamation mark. And then I create, some variable that I want to, like, how about, I'll say date today, which is usually a good name for the date variable. And I'll say a new date. And now I'm programming regular Java. And notice this. See this? Semicolon. You bet. You have to have that. Okay? Now, if I want to go ahead and specify that in my page, see, I've got a date. I can go ahead and just do the Chintziol, today's, or the current server's date and time, and we'll do that in bold. And then I'm going to say, now watch this, angle bracket, now an equal sign here. And that equal sign allows me to specify a Java expression, which basically is a little bit of code that gets converted to HTML right on the fly. And it's angle bracket %equals, then whatever you want to get converted to HTML on the fly, like right here. Notice I do not use the semicolon at the end here. I do not use the semicolon at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and save it. And let's go ahead and rerun the page. So hopefully I have it in my run here. So simple JSP.JSP. Let's see what we get. Now it is taking a while because I did make some changes. And you can see here that it's happening. Now watch the seconds here, okay? Notice the seconds says 32. If I do a F5 to refresh, and I keep on hitting F5, you'll see that the pages or the seconds will change. So let me hit F5 again, and it's getting cached for good performance. Okay, but you did see the seconds changes. All right, so that is some things we can do, and we can actually control some caching, and there is some caching that is enabled by default. All right, so once again, the basic syntax is this is a JSP comment, angle bracket %, two dashes, % angle bracket. This is a page directive. I could specify other things within a page directive. For example, I could say the language, if I was so inclined. And there are other things we can do here, but I could say at page, and I could say language equals Java, okay, and have that instruction there. I can go ahead and specify the whether or not I want a buffer, whether I want to auto flush, more packages to import. So I could go ahead and say angle bracket at page and import some other package here if I wanted to. How about, like, an example would be java.io something. Okay, so I could just essentially keep on building those there, and that's your fundamental syntax of what you're going to be doing with JSP pages. Now the next thing I want to talk to you a little bit about are those implicit objects. Let's go ahead and revisit with a page that I created earlier. So let's quit this and let's go into my directory here. Let's put that scheduler, or I'm going to put that both of those inside of my text editor here. Okay, let's see what we have now. There are implicit objects that we have available to us essentially with JSP. Just like with with servlets rather, we have the HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. Well, we have the same thing going on here. Check it out. In my meeting form.jsp, I specify a method, a form method of get, and an action sending any of this data over to the scheduler.jsp. And what I do is I create input types of like a text box with the name of txt date, a text box with the name of txt time, txt location. Then notice I don't really have any kind of page directive on the scheduler JSP, just a comment, which is pretty much the standard thing to do, what JSP developers do. They always put a comment of the title of the file up there. Now here I could simply use that expression syntax where I do angle bracket percent equals, close the percent angle bracket, and then use request.get parameter, and then the string in here, okay, that parameter is going to be whatever text box or HTML element I'm using. And I didn't have to do anything special to get access to that request object. It is implicitly available to me. It's available to me essentially by default. So let's run that meeting form again. Okay, so the meeting form page comes up. I go ahead and fill out some information let's say it's 2:30 p.m. We'll meet in how about in the Painted Desert. I work for a large bank here in town, and all of our conference rooms are named after sites and famous things here in my beautiful state of Arizona. And then the subject will be, how about this is my life at where I work, strategies. Okay, now watch what happens when I hit submit query. When I hit submit query, I'm sending it to the scheduler.jsp. Let me back this up a little bit. Scheduler, now the question mark is a CGI delimiter, but look at txt date, and it gives me the date. Okay, then what I'll have is then an ampersand to go ahead and signal the next one. TXT location, Painted Desert Room. Yeah, you're probably noticing like plus signs in CGI are spaces. And the idea is I could use this get parameter to pull that information from either a post or a get. In this case, I'm using a get. The last thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is how to handle errors. And if you're going to be using something called scriptlets, which we're going to be talking about a little later on, you can define a page, a JSP page, that whenever an error occurs, that page is loaded. That way people don't get these nasty, ugly errors. And all you do is you use a special page directive called isErrorPage. And you say, yeah, it's true. And then you just come up with some kind of, message that you want to happen when, this page gets loaded, essentially anytime there's a logical Java error. When you go ahead and use that, okay, so now what I do is I come to a page, let's say this page is going to go ahead and have that done. Then what I go and do is I put this line in there and I say error page. And anytime that this page generates an error, call up my error page.jsp. Again, in order to have my error page.jsp come up, you have to specify the isErrorPage page directive with a value of true. In Introduction to JSP Development, gave you a nice little introduction as to how you go about developing JSP pages. What is a JSP page? Why is a JSP page? As well as kind of compare and contrast the benefits, the pros and the cons of opening up, TextPad and developing a full blown on servlet versus writing a nice JSP page. Went over JSP syntax, how you have to include everything inside of the angle bracket percents. That's how the JSP / servlet container knows to process everything on the server. So whatever you have in here gets processed on the server, even if it's just a comment. Talked about variables and expressions. When you create a variable or A variable is going to go angle bracket, percent, exclamation mark, and then your variable code in there. An expression is going to go angle bracket, percent equals, then whatever your expression is. And it's going to go in there. Talked about the two implicit objects, request and response, as well as some JSP directives, specifically the page directive. And you'd specify that page directive with an angle bracket and then an @ sign, and then page, some attribute, and then a value, okay, in quotes, just like that. And that would be a page directive. And then we talked about two special page directives, the is_error page directive and the error page directive to do custom error handling in JSP. I hope you have found this informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.